Sometimes the things we love most are the very things that break our hearts. Margaret Stone had watched her family's mill crumble for 20 years while the whole town called her a fool for refusing to let it go. The old building stood silent against the mountain sky. Its wooden wheels hadn't turned since her father died. Every month brought new bills she couldn't pay, and neighbors who whispered she was wasting her life on worthless ruins. But Margaret held on anyway. Something told her this place still mattered. Her 12-year-old son Samuel didn't care what people said. He loved exploring the old mill, running his hands along the timber beams and listening to the creek flow underneath. The boy saw beauty where others saw decay. He saw possibility where others saw failure. But what exactly had Samuel's great-grandfather hidden inside those timber walls that would make millionaires out of the town's most ridiculed family? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Pine Ridge Valley like an old friend reluctant to leave. Margaret Stone stood at her kitchen window, watching the sun's first rays pierce through the fog to illuminate the stone foundation of her family's mill. The weathered building had been silent for 2 decades, its massive wooden water wheel frozen in time, but it still dominated the landscape with a stubborn dignity that reminded her of her father. She poured coffee into a chipped ceramic mug, one of the few remaining pieces from her grandmother's china set, and allowed herself this daily ritual of remembering. The mill had once been the heartbeat of their small mountain community, grinding grain for families scattered across the valley. Her great-grandfather had built it in 1892 with his own hands, choosing this spot where Clear Creek made a natural bend, providing steady water flow year-round. Margaret's father used to tell her stories about the mill's golden years, when wagons lined up on Saturday mornings and the sound of grinding stones could be heard for miles. Those were the days when the Stone family name meant something in Pine Ridge Valley. Now it meant stubborn foolishness to most folks. "Mom, can I go to the mill after breakfast?" Samuel asked, appearing in the doorway with tousled hair and curious eyes that reminded Margaret painfully of her late husband. At 12, Samuel possessed an old soul that seemed to understand things beyond his years. While other children his age were absorbed with video games and social media, Samuel found wonder in examining the mill's ancient mechanisms and sketching the way morning light filtered through its broken windows. "You know the rules," Margaret said, turning from the window. "Stay away from the loose boards on the second floor. And don't go near the wheel housing without me." Samuel nodded eagerly, already reaching for his worn notebook where he documented every detail of the mill's construction. The boy had filled 3 such journals with careful drawings and observations, treating the old building like a fascinating puzzle waiting to be solved. Margaret didn't have the heart to tell him that some puzzles weren't meant to be solved. They were just meant to be remembered. The sound of gravel crunching in their driveway interrupted her thoughts. Through the window, she watched Emma Caldwell climb out of her pickup truck, carrying what looked like a casserole dish. Emma had been Margaret's closest friend since childhood, one of the few people who didn't think she'd lost her mind by refusing to sell the mill property. "Morning." "Margaret," Emma called as she knocked on the kitchen door. "Brought you some of that cornbread you like." Margaret opened the door gratefully. Emma's presence always brought warmth to their modest home, and her practical nature provided a counterbalance to Margaret's sometimes overwhelming emotions about the mill. "You don't need to keep feeding us," Margaret said, though she was already clearing space on the counter for the dish. "Nonsense. Besides, I need the excuse to check on you both." Emma settled into a kitchen chair with the ease of long-time friendship. "How are things, really?" Margaret glanced toward the living room, where Samuel was gathering his notebook and pencils. "Harrison from the bank called yesterday." Again, Emma's expression darkened. Thomas Harrison had been the bank president for 5 years, ever since moving to Pine Ridge Valley from the city. Unlike his predecessor, a kindly man who had known Margaret's family for generations, Harrison approached every interaction with cold efficiency. What did he want this time? The usual. reminding me that the property taxes are behind, that the mill is a safety hazard, that I'm being unrealistic about its value. Margaret's voice carried the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation too many times. He's got another buyer interested. Some development company from Denver. Development company? Emma frowned. What would they want with mill property? Harrison says they're looking for mountain properties with water access. Probably want to build vacation homes or a resort. Margaret shrugged, but her movements betrayed her anxiety. He made it sound like I'd be crazy not to consider their offer. Samuel appeared in the doorway, notebook tucked under his arm. Can I go now, Mom? Margaret nodded, watching her son head toward the door with his characteristic enthusiasm. Despite everything, the financial pressure, the community whispers, the constant uncertainty, Samuel never lost his fascination with the mill. Sometimes Margaret wondered if she was being selfish. Clinging to the property when selling might provide a more stable future for her son. That boy's got something special, Emma observed, watching Samuel disappear down the path toward the mill. The way he looks at that old building, it's like he sees something the rest of us miss. Margaret poured Emma a cup of coffee and settled across from her friend. His father was the same way. David always said the mill had stories to tell if you knew how to listen. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. David would be proud of you for keeping it in the family. Would he? Margaret's voice cracked slightly. Sometimes I think I'm just being stubborn. The mill hasn't made money since Dad died. The machinery's beyond repair, and I can't afford to restore it. Maybe Harrison's right. Maybe I am being unrealistic. Now you listen to me, Margaret Stone, Emma said firmly. Your great-grandfather didn't build that mill to make money. He built it to serve the community, to create something lasting. Your father understood that, and so did David. Just because the world's changed doesn't mean the mill's purpose has to change with it. Margaret wanted to believe her friend's words, but the stack of unpaid bills on her kitchen counter told a different story. Property taxes, insurance, basic maintenance, it all added up to more than her part-time job at the county library could cover. She'd been drawing from David's small life insurance policy for 3 years now, and that well was nearly dry. The phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. Margaret glanced at the caller ID and sighed. Harrison again? Emma asked. Margaret nodded, letting the call go to voicemail. She knew what he'd say, the same thing he'd been saying for months. The property was a financial burden. The mill was unsafe. The development company's offer was generous and wouldn't stay on the table forever. He's not going to give up, Margaret said. Neither are you, Emma replied confidently. You've got Stone blood in your veins. Your great-grandfather didn't give up when the railroad company tried to buy him out. Your father didn't give up during the drought of '78, and you're not going to give up now. Margaret appreciated Emma's faith, but she couldn't ignore the practical realities. Samuel would be starting high school in a few years, and then college if she could manage it. The boy was bright, brilliant really, and deserved opportunities beyond what Pine Ridge Valley could offer. How could she justify keeping a crumbling mill when selling might secure his future? Through the window, she could see Samuel sitting on the mill's front step, sketching something in his notebook with intense concentration. The sight made her heart ache with love and uncertainty in equal measure. Emma, she said quietly, what if I'm wrong? What if holding on to the mill is just selfishness disguised as sentiment? Her friend was quiet for a long moment, considering the question seriously. Margaret, I've known you since we were Samuel's age. You're one of the most unselfish people I've ever met. If you're holding on to that mill, it's not because you're being selfish. It's because somewhere deep down you know it still has a purpose. Margaret nodded, though doubt continued to gnaw at her. The mill did feel purposeful somehow, as if it were waiting for something. But waiting for what? And how long could she afford to wait while the bills piled up and Harrison's pressure increased? As if summoned by her thoughts, Samuel came running up the path from the mill, his face flushed with excitement and his notebook clutched against his chest. "Mom! Emma!" he called as he burst through the kitchen door. "You have to see what I found." Margaret and Emma exchanged glances. Samuel's discoveries usually involved interesting rock formations or unusual bird nests, the kinds of treasures that delighted 12-year-old boys but held little significance for adults. "What is it?" "Honey!" Margaret asked, trying to match his enthusiasm. Samuel opened his notebook and carefully withdrew a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age and brittle around the edges. It was tucked behind a loose stone in the mill's foundation. "I was sketching the stonework when I noticed this piece was different from the others." Margaret took the paper gently, unfolding it with care. The handwriting was faded but legible, her great-grandfather's distinctive script that she remembered from old family letters. "What does it say?" Emma asked, leaning closer. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she read the words aloud. "To my descendants who carry the stone name, this mill holds more than memory. What feeds the body can also feed the soul, but only those who understand the mill's true purpose will discover the treasure beyond measure. Look not to the grinding stones for what you seek, but to what lies beneath the wheel itself. The water knows the way." The kitchen fell silent except for the steady tick of the wall clock. Margaret read the note twice more, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. "Great-grandfather wrote this," she whispered. Samuel nodded eagerly. "It has his signature at the bottom, see? Jeremiah Stone, 1943. Emma moved closer, studying the paper. "Treasure beyond measure. What do you think he meant?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "I don't know. Dad never mentioned anything about great-grandfather hiding anything at the mill." "Maybe he didn't know," Samuel suggested. "Maybe great-grandfather was keeping it secret for a reason." Margaret looked at her son's excited face and felt her heart sink. She recognized that expression. It was the same look David used to get when he talked about restoring the mill to its former glory. It was the look of someone who believed in possibilities. "Samuel, honey," she said gently, "sometimes old papers like this are just—" "Mom, listen," Samuel interrupted, his voice taking on an unusually serious tone. "I've been studying the mill's construction for 2 years. I know every stone, every beam, every part of that building. This paper was hidden specifically. Great-grandfather wanted someone to find it." Emma studied the note again. "The water knows the way. That's an interesting phrase. Your great-grandfather was known for his wisdom, Margaret. He wouldn't have written something like this without reason." Margaret wanted to dismiss the note as romantic nonsense, but something about her great-grandfather's words stirred a memory. She recalled her father mentioning that Jeremiah Stone had been an unusual man, thoughtful, deliberate, someone who planned far ahead. He'd built the mill to last generations, choosing materials and methods that went beyond what was strictly necessary. "What do you think we should do?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer. Samuel's eyes lit up. "We have to investigate. We have to find out what he meant about what lies beneath the wheel." Margaret glanced at Emma, who nodded encouragingly. "It couldn't hurt to look, could it? Besides, it might help you understand the mill better, whether you decide to keep it or not." That afternoon, Margaret found herself standing beside the old water wheel for the first time in months. She usually avoided this part of the mill, the sight of the massive wooden structure. Once so vital and alive, now still and covered with moss, always filled her with sadness. Samuel crouched near the wheel's base, examining the stone foundation with the intensity of an archaeologist. "Look at this, Mom. The stonework here is different from the rest of the mill. These blocks are bigger, and they're fitted together differently." Margaret knelt beside her son, running her fingers over the weathered stones. He was right. The construction here did seem more elaborate, more carefully planned. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Samuel consulted his notebook, flipping through pages of detailed sketches. "I think great-grandfather built something special here, something he wanted to protect." As Margaret studied her son's drawings, she felt a flutter of something she hadn't experienced in years. Hope. Maybe Emma was right. Maybe the mill still had a purpose. And maybe, just maybe, her great-grandfather had left them more than just memories. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the mill yard. Margaret knew they should head back to the house, but something kept her rooted to this spot beside the silent wheel. "Tomorrow," she said quietly. "We'll come back tomorrow and look more carefully." Samuel grinned and carefully folded the old letter back into his notebook. As they walked toward the house, Margaret felt as if she were standing at the edge of something significant. She didn't know what they might find beneath the water wheel, but for the first time in years, she was eager to discover what tomorrow might bring. Behind them, the mill stood silhouetted against the evening sky, keeping its secrets for one more night. The next morning arrived with the kind of crisp mountain air that made everything seem possible. Margaret had barely slept, her mind churning over her great-grandfather's words. What lies beneath the wheel itself? The water knows the way. She'd spent hours staring at the ceiling, alternating between excitement and skepticism, wondering if she was about to embark on a fool's errand or something far more significant. Samuel was already dressed and waiting in the kitchen when she came downstairs, his notebook and a small flashlight laid out on the table like tools for an expedition. "I've been thinking about the letter all night," he said, barely containing his enthusiasm. "The water knows the way. What if great-grandfather meant the creek itself? What if there's something where the water meets the wheel?" Margaret poured herself coffee and studied her son's eager face. At 12, Samuel possessed a logical mind that impressed even the adults who knew him. His teachers often commented on his unusual ability to see patterns and connections that others missed. "All right," she said, surprising herself with the decision. "After breakfast, we'll take a closer look." They walked to the mill together, the morning dew still clinging to the tall grass that had grown up around the building's foundation. The water wheel loomed before them, 30 feet in diameter and constructed from oak timbers that had weathered to a silver gray. Even motionless, it retained an impressive dignity. Samuel immediately began examining the wheel's base, where it met the creek. The water flowed beneath the structure through a carefully engineered channel that her great-grandfather had carved from the natural streambed. "Mom, look at this," Samuel called, his voice tight with excitement. Margaret hurried to where her son was crouched beside the stone channel. Samuel pointed to what appeared to be a small symbol carved into one of the foundation stones, a simple design that looked like a mill wheel with water flowing beneath it. "I've never noticed that before," Margaret said, running her finger over the carved symbol. "It's been covered by moss and mud," Samuel explained. "But when I cleared it away," he brushed more debris from the stone, revealing that the symbol was actually part of a larger carving. Additional marks emerged, what looked like an arrow pointing downstream, and beneath that, a series of small marks that could have been numbers or letters. Margaret felt her pulse quicken. This wasn't coincidence. Her great-grandfather had deliberately marked this spot. "What do you think it means?" she asked. Samuel consulted the letter again, reading the words carefully. "Look not to the grinding stones for what you seek, but to what lies beneath the wheel itself. The water knows the way." He looked up at Margaret with growing excitement. "What if there's something hidden in the channel? Something underwater?" Margaret studied the creek where it flowed beneath the wheel. The water was clear, but deep enough that she couldn't see the bottom clearly. The channel was perhaps 4 feet wide and had been expertly carved to direct the water flow efficiently. It would have to be something waterproof, she mused. Something that could survive being underwater for decades. Samuel was already rolling up his sleeves. "There's only one way to find out. Samuel, wait." But her son had already waded into the creek, the cold mountain water reaching nearly to his knees. Margaret watched nervously as he felt along the stone bottom with his hands, following the line of the carved symbols. "The stones down here are different too," Samuel called over the sound of flowing water. "They're not just natural creek bed. Great-grandfather laid these stones deliberately." Margaret kicked off her shoes and joined Samuel in the creek, gasping at the shock of cold water. Together they felt along the carefully constructed channel, their fingers searching for anything that didn't belong to the natural stream bed. "Here." Samuel's voice carried a note of triumph. "There's something here." Margaret moved to where Samuel was standing. Beneath the water, wedged between 2 large foundation stones, she could feel the edge of something smooth and hard. It was wrapped in what felt like oiled cloth or leather. Working together, they managed to work the object free from its hiding place. It was a bundle about the size of a book, wrapped in what proved to be an oiled leather pouch that had protected its contents from decades of flowing water. They climbed out of the creek and sat on a nearby log, both of them dripping and shivering, but too excited to care about their discomfort. Margaret carefully unwrapped the leather pouch, revealing another letter in her great-grandfather's handwriting, along with what appeared to be a hand-drawn map. "My dear descendants," Margaret read aloud, her voice trembling slightly. "If you have found this message, then you possess the persistence and wisdom that I hoped would run in our family's blood. The mill I built serves a purpose beyond the grinding of grain, though few will ever know its true significance." She paused, looking at Samuel's rapt face before continuing. "During the hardships of the 1930s, I discovered that our mountain held more wealth than most realized. The creek that powers our mill carries more than water. It carries the evidence of silver and gold deposits upstream. I have spent 20 years quietly gathering what the mountain offered, storing it safely for a time when our family might have need." Margaret's hands began to shake as she read the next lines. "What I have hidden will provide security for generations of Stones, if handled wisely. But it must remain secret until the right time. Trust no one outside the family. The mill's true treasure lies not in any single hiding place, but in a system I have created. Use the map to find the first cache. Each discovery will lead to the next, until you have recovered what I have gathered for you." The letter was signed and dated, Jeremiah Stone, October 15th, 1943. Samuel leaned closer to examine the map. It showed a detailed layout of the mill property, with various landmarks marked, and what appeared to be a series of connected symbols leading from one location to another. "Mom," Samuel whispered. "Her great-grandfather was telling the truth. There really is treasure." Margaret stared at the documents in her hands, her mind reeling. Could it be possible? Had her great-grandfather really hidden a fortune somewhere on their property? The practical part of her mind insisted this was fantasy, but the evidence was literally in her hands. "What do we do now?" Samuel asked. Before Margaret could answer, the sound of a car engine drew their attention. Through the trees, she could see a black sedan pulling into their driveway. Even at this distance, she recognized the car. It belonged to Thomas Harrison from the bank. "Quick!" Margaret said, carefully rewrapping the documents in the leather pouch. "We can't let anyone see these." They hurried back to the house, Margaret's mind racing. Harrison's timing couldn't be coincidental. He'd been pressuring her to sell for months, and now he was showing up unannounced, just as they'd made their incredible discovery. Harrison was waiting on their front porch when they arrived, his business suit looking out of place in the rustic mountain setting. He was a thin man in his 50s, with prematurely grey hair and calculating eyes that seemed to evaluate everything in terms of dollars and cents. "Miss Stone," he said with his practiced smile, "I hope you don't mind me stopping by unannounced. I have some news that I think you'll want to hear." Margaret forced herself to return his smile, while discreetly slipping the leather pouch to Samuel behind her back. "Of course, Mr. Harrison. What can I do for you?" "The development company I mentioned has increased their offer," Harrison said, producing a folder from his briefcase. "They're now prepared to offer $300,000 for the mill property. Cash, with a 30-day closing." Margaret's breath caught. $300,000 was more money than she'd ever imagined having. It would solve all their financial problems and secure Samuel's future. "That's very generous," she managed to say. "It is indeed," Harrison agreed. "In fact, it's probably more than the property is worth, but they're motivated to close quickly. I'd hate to see you miss this opportunity, especially given your current financial situation." There was something in Harrison's tone that made Margaret uncomfortable, a subtle pressure that felt almost threatening. "I'll need some time to consider it," Margaret said. Harrison's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Of course. But I should mention that this offer has an expiration date. They need an answer by the end of the week." After Harrison left, Margaret and Samuel sat in the kitchen, the leather pouch between them on the table. The banker's visit had added a new urgency to their situation. "Mom," Samuel said quietly, "we have to follow the map. We have to find out what great-grandfather left for us. Margaret nodded, though her heart was pounding with anxiety. In the space of 2 days, her quiet life had been turned upside down. She was now sitting on what might be a family fortune, while facing pressure to sell the very land where it was hidden. "Yes," she said finally. "We have to know the truth. But Samuel, we can't tell anyone about this, not yet. Not until we understand what we're dealing with." Samuel nodded solemnly, understanding the gravity of the situation despite his youth. Margaret looked out the window toward the mill, its familiar silhouette now charged with new meaning. Her great-grandfather had been a careful, thoughtful man. If he had hidden a treasure, he'd done it for good reasons. And if Thomas Harrison was pushing so hard for a quick sale, there might be more to his urgency than simple business opportunity. The next few days would determine whether the Stone family's fortunes were about to change forever. Margaret spent that night studying her great-grandfather's map by lamplight, tracing the intricate symbols with her finger while Samuel slept. The hand-drawn diagram showed remarkable detail. Every building, every tree, every significant rock formation on their property was carefully marked. But it was the series of connected symbols that fascinated her most. They formed a path that began at the mill and wound through various locations across their 20-acre property. The first symbol appeared to point toward the old mill office, a small stone building that had served as her great-grandfather's workspace. Margaret had rarely entered the building since her father's death. It felt too much like disturbing a shrine to family history. Early the next morning, she and Samuel made their way to the office building. Unlike the main mill structure, the office had been built entirely of stone, with thick walls and a slate roof that had weathered the decades remarkably well. Margaret produced the old brass key from her father's key ring, noting how the lock still turned smoothly despite years of disuse. The interior smelled of old wood and leather, with dust motes dancing in the morning sunlight that streamed through small windows. Her great-grandfather's desk dominated the room, a massive oak piece that her father had always said was built to last forever. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with agricultural journals, account books, and technical manuals dating back to the mill's early days. According to the map, "We should look for something marked with the same symbol we found by the water wheel," Samuel said. Consulting the leather-wrapped documents, they began searching methodically, examining every surface for carved or painted symbols. Margaret opened desk drawers while Samuel checked the lower shelves and floor. It was Samuel who found it, a small carving in the wooden panel beneath the desk's bottom drawer. "Mom, here!" He pointed to a symbol identical to the one they'd found by the creek. Carved discreetly into the wood, where it would normally be hidden by the chair, Margaret knelt beside him, running her fingers over the carving. "There must be something here. Help me move the desk." Working together, they managed to shift the heavy desk enough to reveal what lay beneath. Built into the stone floor was a small compartment, covered by a fitted stone slab that blended perfectly with the surrounding floor. The slab lifted away to reveal a cache containing several items wrapped in oiled cloth. Margaret's hands trembled as she unwrapped the first bundle. Inside were rolled papers, what appeared to be original architectural plans for the mill. But these weren't the simple blueprints she might have expected. These plans showed a level of detail and complexity that spoke of engineering far beyond basic grain milling. "Look at this," Samuel said, spreading the plans across the desk. "These show hidden chambers and passages I never knew existed." Margaret studied the blueprints with growing amazement. The plans revealed that the mill contained several concealed spaces, chambers built into the walls, passages connecting different levels, and most intriguingly, what appeared to be an underground storage area beneath the main grinding floor. "Great-grandfather designed this place like a fortress," Margaret murmured. "But why?" Samuel traced his finger along the blueprints, following a series of dotted lines that seemed to indicate hidden pathways. "Maybe he needed to keep things secret. Maybe during the Depression, people couldn't trust banks or even neighbors." The second bundle contained a detailed journal written in her great-grandfather's methodical handwriting. Margaret opened it carefully, reading the first entry, dated September 3rd, 1933. Gold prices have risen again, she read aloud. The government's monetary policies have created opportunity for those wise enough to recognize it. The creek continues to yield modest amounts of color, and I have identified several promising upstream locations. Hannah worries about my secretiveness, but these are dangerous times for a man with resources. Margaret flipped through several pages, each entry documenting her great-grandfather's careful accumulation of precious metals. He had clearly been collecting gold and silver for years, using knowledge of local geology and stream patterns that few others possessed. He was mining, Samuel said with excitement. Great-grandfather was secretly mining gold and silver from our property. The journal entries painted a picture of a man who understood that economic uncertainty required preparation. Jeremiah Stone had watched banks fail during the Depression and had decided to create his own form of security. But rather than simply hoarding cash, he had turned to precious metals and had hidden them using the mill's complex hidden spaces. Listen to this entry, Margaret said, finding a passage dated October 1943. I have completed the final cache. The system is now ready to provide for my descendants when they have need. Each location contains enough to ensure comfort, but the true wealth lies in the accumulated whole. I pray that my family will be worthy of this trust. A knock at the office door made both of them jump. Margaret quickly gathered the documents while Samuel peered out the window. It's Emma, he reported with relief. Margaret opened the door to find her friend carrying a thermos and looking concerned. I saw you both heading over here early and thought you might need some coffee, Emma said. Everything all right? You look like you've seen a ghost. Margaret glanced at Samuel, who nodded slightly. They had agreed the night before that Emma could be trusted with their secret if necessary. Emma, Margaret said carefully, how much do you know about my great-grandfather's business during the Depression? Emma stepped inside, setting the thermos on the desk. Jeremiah Stone. Well, I know he was one of the few people in the valley who seemed to weather the hard times without much trouble. My grandmother used to say he had a gift for making money when others were losing it. Did anyone ever suspect he was involved in mining? Emma's eyebrows rose. Mining? Not that I ever heard. Though now that you mention it, he did spend a lot of time up in the mountains. People assumed he was hunting or checking on livestock, but she paused, studying Margaret's face. Why are you asking? Margaret made a decision. Because we found this. She showed Emma the journal and blueprints, watching her friend's expression change from curiosity to amazement as she absorbed what she was seeing. My lord, Emma whispered. Are you telling me Jeremiah Stone was secretly mining precious metals? It appears so, Margaret said. And according to this journal, he hid substantial amounts around the property. Emma sank into a chair, studying the architectural plans. No wonder Harrison's been so persistent about buying the property. If there are rumors about mineral deposits, what do you mean? Samuel asked. Emma looked up from the blueprints. Thomas Harrison didn't grow up here like the rest of us. He came from Denver 5 years ago. People assumed he wanted small-town banking, but maybe he had other reasons for moving to Pine Ridge Valley. Margaret felt a chill of understanding. You think he knows something about the mining potential? I think it's awfully convenient that a city banker suddenly becomes interested in a rural property that supposedly has no value beyond sentiment. Samuel had been studying the journal while the adults talked. Mom, look at this entry from 1942. Great-grandfather mentions visitors asking questions about the mill's water rights and mineral claims. Margaret read the passage Samuel indicated. Her great-grandfather had written about strangers from mining companies who had approached him about purchasing mineral rights to his property. He had refused all offers, but the journal entries suggested he had become increasingly cautious about protecting his secret operations. He was worried about outside interest even then, Margaret realized. That's why he created such an elaborate hiding system. Emma stood up, her expression determined. Margaret, you need to be very careful about how you proceed. If there really is treasure hidden on this property, and if Harrison suspects it exists, you could be in more danger than you realize. Margaret nodded, understanding the gravity of their situation. They weren't just dealing with family history anymore. They were potentially sitting on valuable assets that others might be willing to do almost anything to obtain. We need to find out exactly what great-grandfather left for us, Margaret said. But we need to do it quietly, and we need to do it fast. Samuel carefully refolded the blueprints. According to the map, the next location is in the main mill building. There's supposed to be a hidden chamber behind the main grinding stones. Margaret looked at her son and her best friend, feeling the weight of decisions that would affect all their futures. Then that's where we go next. The main mill building felt different now that Margaret knew its secrets. What had once seemed like a simple structure for grinding grain now revealed itself as an elaborate maze of hidden purposes. She and Samuel stood before the massive grinding stones, studying the blueprints by flashlight in the dim interior. According to the architectural plans, a concealed chamber lay behind the eastern grinding stone, accessible through a mechanism built into the stone foundation. Samuel ran his hands along the massive circular stones, looking for anything that might serve as a trigger or release. The blueprints show something here, Samuel said, pointing to a specific section of the drawing. Some kind of rotating mechanism. Margaret examined the stone more carefully, noting how the morning light from the high windows revealed subtle differences in the stonework. One section appeared to be constructed differently from the rest, fitted together with smaller stones that formed an almost decorative pattern. Try pressing on different stones, Margaret suggested. Great-grandfather would have designed something that looked natural, but could be operated by someone who knew the secret. Samuel began systematically pressing each stone in the distinctive pattern. On his seventh attempt, they heard a soft grinding sound, and a section of the wall began to swing inward on hidden hinges. It worked! Samuel exclaimed, his voice echoing in the suddenly revealed space beyond. Margaret shone her flashlight into the opening, revealing a narrow chamber about 6 feet deep and 4 feet wide. The space contained several wooden crates and what appeared to be more documents wrapped in protective coverings. They carried the crates outside into the daylight, Margaret's heart pounding with anticipation. The first crate was heavier than expected, and when Samuel pried off the lid, they both gasped at what lay inside. Nestled in carefully arranged compartments were pieces of antique mining equipment, a gold pan, small picks, sieves, and what appeared to be a mercury amalgamation kit. But it was the collection of small glass vials that caught Margaret's attention. Each vial contained what looked like gold flakes and silver particles, carefully labeled with dates and locations. Great-grandfather really was mining. Samuel breathed, holding up one of the vials to catch the light, and he was keeping detailed records of everything he found. The second crate contained more mining tools, but these were specialized instruments that spoke of serious geological knowledge. Margaret recognized a compass, surveying equipment, and what appeared to be rock analysis tools. Her great-grandfather hadn't been casually panning for gold. He'd been conducting systematic mining operations. "Look at this," Samuel said, unwrapping one of the document bundles. "It's a map of the entire mountain region with mineral deposits marked." Margaret studied the map with growing amazement. Jeremiah Stone had identified dozens of potential mining locations throughout the Pine Ridge Valley area, with detailed notes about soil composition, water flow patterns, and seasonal accessibility. The map showed a level of geological understanding that would have rivaled professional mining operations. "According to these notes," Margaret said, reading from a attached document, he believed there was a major silver vein running through our property and extending up into the national forest land. Samuel traced his finger along the marked vein. If he was right, that would explain why the development company is so interested in buying our land. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Harrison and his development company knew about the mineral potential, they weren't just buying land for vacation homes. They were positioning themselves to exploit valuable mining rights. "We need to understand what we're really dealing with," Margaret said. These mining tools and samples prove great-grandfather was finding precious metals, but how much did he actually accumulate? Samuel was already consulting the treasure map from the creek cache. According to this, there are 6 more locations marked on our property. The mining equipment might just be the beginning. Margaret felt a mixture of excitement and fear. Each discovery seemed to increase both their potential wealth and their danger. If valuable mineral deposits existed on their land, selling to Harrison's development company would mean giving away a fortune. We need expert help, Margaret realized. Someone who can tell us what we're really looking at. What about Dr. Wells? Samuel suggested. She knows all the local history. Maybe she knows something about great-grandfather's activities. Dr. Patricia Wells lived in a modest house near the town center, surrounded by gardens that reflected her love of local flora. Margaret had known her for years as the valley's unofficial historian and retired geology professor. If anyone could provide context for their discoveries, it would be Dr. Wells. They found the elderly woman tending her herb garden, her silver hair covered by a well-worn sun hat. Dr. Wells was in her 70s, but possessed the energy and curiosity of someone half her age. Margaret! Samuel, she called warmly. What brings you by on such a lovely morning? Margaret glanced around to ensure they weren't being observed, then carefully explained their discoveries. Dr. Wells listened with growing fascination, occasionally asking questions that revealed her deep knowledge of local geology and history. Your great-grandfather was a remarkable man, Dr. Wells said when Margaret finished. I always suspected he knew more about this mountain than he let on. Did you know he was mining? Samuel asked. Dr. Wells smiled mysteriously. I had my suspicions. Jeremiah Stone was one of the few people in the valley who seemed genuinely unconcerned about the depression, and he had an unusual interest in geological surveys for someone who supposedly only grew grain. She led them to her study, pulling out several thick books and geological charts. The Pine Ridge Valley sits on some of the most interesting mineral formations in this part of Colorado. Most people don't realize it because the visible evidence is subtle, but there are definitely precious metal deposits throughout this region. Dr. Wells spread out a professional geological survey map pointing to various marked areas. And see these formations. They indicate potential silver and gold deposits. Your family's property sits right in the middle of what could be a very rich mineral zone. Margaret studied the map, noting how the marked formations aligned closely with her great-grandfather's hand-drawn annotations. So he was right about the mineral potential? More than right, Dr. Wells confirmed. He was conducting legitimate geological research decades before official surveys confirmed what he had discovered. Samuel showed Dr. Wells some of the mineral samples they had found. The elderly woman examined them with obvious expertise, using a magnifying glass and making notes in a small notebook. These samples show significant silver content, she announced after several minutes of examination. And this gold sample, while small, appears to be high quality. Your great-grandfather definitely knew what he was doing. Margaret felt a surge of vindication mixed with worry. Dr. Wells, if our property really contains valuable minerals, what should we do about it? The elderly woman's expression grew serious. That depends on several factors. Do you have clear title to the mineral rights? Are you prepared to deal with the legal and practical complexities of mining operations? And most importantly, who else knows about this potential wealth? Margaret explained Harrison's persistent attempts to purchase the property and his connection to the Denver Development Company. Dr. Wells nodded grimly. I was afraid of that. Thomas Harrison has been asking questions around town about local geology and mineral rights. I thought he was just making conversation, but now I suspect he has inside information. Inside information? Samuel asked. Geological surveys, mining reports, possibly even historical records that most people don't know exist, Dr. Wells explained. If Harrison represents investors who specialize in mineral rights acquisition, they may have done extensive research before approaching you. Margaret realized their situation was becoming more complex by the hour. They weren't just dealing with family treasure anymore. They were potentially sitting on mineral rights worth far more than Harrison's development company was offering. "What would you recommend?" Margaret asked. Dr. Wells was quiet for several moments, clearly weighing her words carefully. "First, you need to complete your great-grandfather's treasure map. Understanding exactly what he left for you will help you make informed decisions. Second, you need legal advice about mineral rights and property law. And third," she paused, looking directly at Margaret, "you need to be very careful about who you trust." As they prepared to leave, Dr. Wells pulled Margaret aside. "Your great-grandfather was a wise man who planned for the future. He wouldn't have created this elaborate system unless he believed his family would need it someday. Don't let anyone pressure you into decisions before you understand what you're really giving up." Walking back toward their property, Margaret felt the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. Samuel's excitement was infectious, but she couldn't ignore the potential dangers they were facing. If their land really contained valuable mineral deposits, and if Harrison suspected their worth, they needed to move quickly and carefully. "Tomorrow," she told Samuel, "we follow the map to the next location. But from now on, we tell no one else about what we find." "No one." Samuel nodded solemnly, understanding that their treasure hunt had evolved into something far more serious than either of them had originally imagined. That evening, Margaret sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, studying the coded ledger book they had discovered in the mill's hidden chamber. The pages were filled with her great-grandfather's careful handwriting, but the entries were written in a system of numbers and symbols that defied easy interpretation. Samuel had already gone to bed, exhausted from their day of discoveries, but Margaret found herself too energized to sleep. The ledger clearly documented financial transactions, but the amounts were recorded in a code that protected the information from casual observers. She had always known her great-grandfather was a methodical man, but the complexity of his record-keeping system revealed a level of caution that spoke to the dangerous times he had lived through. During the Depression, a man with hidden wealth needed to be extraordinarily careful about protecting his secrets. Margaret traced her finger down one page of entries, noting the recurring patterns. Certain symbols appeared frequently, often followed by numbers that might represent dates, quantities, or locations. If she could crack the code, she might understand the full scope of what Jeremiah Stone had accumulated. A soft knock at her kitchen door interrupted her concentration. Margaret glanced at the clock. Nearly 10 o'clock, unusually late for visitors in Pine Ridge Valley. She approached the door cautiously, peering through the window to see Emma standing on her porch. "Sorry to bother you so late," Emma said when Margaret opened the door, "but I couldn't stop thinking about what you showed me today. I remembered something that might be important." Margaret invited her friend inside, grateful for the company and curious about what Emma had remembered. "After you left this afternoon, I called my grandmother," Emma explained, settling into a kitchen chair. "She's 93 now, but her memory for old times is still sharp. I asked her about Jeremiah Stone and his activities during the Depression." Margaret poured Emma a cup of tea and waited for her to continue. "Grandmother told me something interesting," Emma said. "She remembered that your great-grandfather used to disappear for days at a time, supposedly checking on livestock in the high pastures. But he never took a horse or pack mule. Just walked up into the mountains with a small pack and his walking stick. That does seem unusual for checking livestock." Margaret agreed. "But here's the really interesting part," Emma continued. "Grandmother said he always came back with his pack heavier than when he left. She noticed because she used to watch him from her kitchen window when he passed by their farm." Margaret felt a chill of excitement. "He was carrying something down from the mountains. That's what I thought too. And there's more." Emma leaned forward conspiratorially. "Grandmother said that during the worst years of the Depression, when other families were struggling to buy basic necessities, your great-grandfather always seemed to have cash available. He helped several families with loans when the bank couldn't or wouldn't help them." Margaret thought about the implications. If Jeremiah Stone had been regularly bringing valuable materials down from the mountains, And if he had been quietly helping community members with financial assistance, he must have accumulated substantial wealth. Emma, Margaret said slowly. What if the treasure isn't just what he hid around our property? What if there are mining sites up in the mountains where he was actively extracting precious metals? Emma's eyes widened. You mean he might have had actual mining claims? Margaret pulled out the coded ledger and showed Emma some of the more complex entries. Look at these records. Some of them seem to reference locations that aren't on our property. What if he was working multiple sites? They spent the next hour examining the ledger together, trying to identify patterns that might reveal the locations or nature of the various entries. Samuel's natural aptitude for pattern recognition would have been helpful, but Margaret didn't want to wake him. This symbol appears frequently, Emma observed, pointing to a mark that looked like a mountain peak with a star above it. And it's always followed by larger numbers than the other entries. Margaret studied the symbol Emma had identified. Mountain locations, maybe? The star could indicate particularly productive sites. As they worked to decode the ledger, Margaret found herself thinking about the broader implications of their discoveries. If her great-grandfather had established mining operations in the National Forest land above their property, those sites might still contain valuable deposits. But they would also be much more difficult to access legally. We need to be systematic about this, Margaret realized. Before we can make any decisions about the property or Harrison's offers, we need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with. Emma nodded in agreement. Have you given any more thought to Harrison's timeline? He wants an answer by the end of the week. Margaret had been trying not to think about the deadline, but Emma's question forced her to confront the time pressure they were facing. If we refuse his offer without understanding what we're giving up, we might regret it forever. But if we accept it and later discover we've sold a fortune for a fraction of its value, you'd regret that even more, Emma finished. A thought occurred to Margaret. Emma, you know everyone in this valley. Have you heard any rumors about geological surveys or mining company interest in the area? Emma was quiet for a moment, searching her memory. Now that you mention it, there have been some unusual visitors in town over the past few months. Men in expensive suits asking questions at the courthouse about property records and mineral rights. At the time, I thought they might be developers looking for recreational property, but they might have been researching mining potential, Margaret concluded. There's something else, Emma said hesitantly. They didn't think much of it at the time, but last month I saw Harrison having lunch with two men from out of town. They were looking at maps and papers, and when I walked by their table, they stopped talking and put the papers away. Margaret felt a growing sense of urgency. If Harrison was working with outside investors who had researched the area's mineral potential, they were operating with far more information than she possessed. The coded ledger might hold the key to understanding what her family really owned, but she was running out of time to decode it. Tomorrow, Margaret decided. Samuel and I continue following great-grandfather's map. We need to find the remaining caches and understand what he left for us. Then we can make informed decisions about how to proceed. Emma reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. Whatever you decide, you're not facing this alone. I'll help however I can. After Emma left, Margaret returned to the coded ledger with renewed determination. She worked until well past midnight, making notes and trying different approaches to breaking the cipher. By the time she finally went to bed, she had identified several recurring patterns that might represent locations, dates, or quantities. As she drifted off to sleep, Margaret found herself thinking about her great-grandfather's careful planning. Jeremiah Stone had created this elaborate system not just to hide wealth, but to ensure that his descendants would have the information they needed to make wise decisions. She was beginning to understand that the real treasure wasn't just gold and silver, it was knowledge and preparation. The next morning would bring new discoveries, but Margaret felt increasingly confident that her family's future lay not in selling to Harrison's development company, but in understanding and claiming their true inheritance. Margaret woke to find Samuel already in the kitchen. The coded ledger spread open before him alongside his notebook and several pencils. The boy had always been an early riser, but this morning his intensity suggested he had been working for some time. "I think I figured out part of the code," Samuel announced without looking up from his work. Margaret poured herself coffee and sat beside her son, amazed by his systematic approach to the cipher. Samuel had created charts showing the frequency of different symbols and had begun testing various substitution patterns. "Look at this," Samuel said, pointing to a series of entries from 1934. "These symbols here appear every few weeks, always followed by the same type of numbers. I think they represent regular trips to the same locations." Margaret studied Samuel's analysis. Her son had identified patterns that had escaped her tired mind the night before. The regularity of certain entries did suggest routine activities, perhaps regular visits to established mining sites. "And here," Samuel continued, flipping to a later section of the ledger, "the entries change in 1940. The amounts get larger, and new symbols start appearing. I think great-grandfather expanded his operations during the war years." Margaret realized that Samuel's natural aptitude for puzzles and patterns made him far better suited to decode the ledger than she was. "What do you think the larger amounts represent?" "Maybe he found richer deposits," Samuel suggested. "Or maybe precious metal prices increased during the war, making the same quantities worth more money." Samuel's logical thinking impressed Margaret once again. At 12, her son possessed analytical skills that many adults would envy. "According to the treasure map," Samuel said, consulting the documents from their first cache, "our next location should be in the old barn foundation. Want to check it out?" The barn had collapsed during a severe winter storm 15 years earlier, leaving only its stone foundation and scattered timber. Margaret had always intended to clear the debris, but other priorities had taken precedence. Now the rubble-strewn area might hold another piece of their family puzzle. They walked to the barn site together, the morning air crisp with the promise of another clear mountain day. Samuel immediately began examining the foundation stones, looking for the distinctive symbols that had marked their previous discoveries. "Here," Samuel called from the eastern corner of the foundation. "Same symbol as before, carved into this cornerstone." Margaret joined him, noting how the carved symbol was positioned to be visible only from inside the original barn structure. Her great-grandfather had been consistently careful about concealing his markers from casual observation. Following the pattern they had learned, they began examining the area around the marked stone for signs of a hidden cache. It was Margaret who discovered that several stones in the foundation could be shifted, revealing a hollow space beneath. The cache they uncovered was different from the previous ones. Instead of documents or tools, this hiding place contained small leather pouches, each carefully wrapped and labeled. Margaret opened the first pouch with trembling hands. Inside were silver coins, dozens of them, dating from the 1800s and early 1900s. Many appeared to be rare collector pieces that would be worth far more than their silver content alone. "Look at these dates," Samuel said, examining another pouch. "Some of these coins are really old. Great-grandfather must have been collecting them for years." Margaret counted the coins from the first few pouches, estimating their potential value. Even without considering their collectible worth, the silver content alone represented thousands of dollars. "And there were more than a dozen pouches in the cache." "Samuel," Margaret said quietly, "I think we're looking at serious money here." But it was the discovery in the final pouch that truly took Margaret's breath away. Wrapped in silk cloth were several small gold nuggets, each one carefully labeled with a date and location. The nuggets were beautiful, smooth, naturally formed pieces that spoke of the mountain's hidden wealth. Samuel held one of the nuggets up to catch the morning light. "Mum, these aren't just flakes like the samples we found before. These are substantial pieces." Margaret examined the labels on the gold nuggets, noting that the locations referenced were all in the high country above their property. Her great-grandfather had indeed been working mining sites in the mountains, and those sites had been productive enough to yield nuggets of significant size. "We need to research the value of these coins and gold pieces," Margaret realized. "But first, let's continue following the map." I want to understand the full scope of what great-grandfather left us before we start making decisions. They carefully rewrapped the coins and gold, placing everything in a secure box that Margaret could hide in their house. As they worked, Margaret found herself thinking about the timeline they were facing. Harrison's deadline was approaching, and each new discovery made the thought of selling the property more difficult to contemplate. "Samuel," Margaret said as they walked back toward the house, "what do you think about Harrison's offer? If we have all this treasure, do we still need to worry about money?" Samuel was quiet for several moments, his young mind wrestling with complex implications. "I think great-grandfather left us this treasure for a reason," he said finally. "Maybe he knew that someday our family would face pressure to sell the land. Maybe he wanted to make sure we'd have the resources to keep it if we chose to." Margaret was struck by her son's wisdom. Samuel understood instinctively what she was beginning to realize. The treasure wasn't just about money. It was about preserving the family legacy and maintaining independence in the face of outside pressure. "There's something else," Samuel added. "The coded ledger shows entries continuing right up to 1943, the year great-grandfather wrote his final letter. But some of the mountain locations marked in the ledger aren't included in our treasure map." Margaret stopped walking. "What do you mean?" "I mean, there might be active mining sites that great-grandfather was working, sites that still contain valuable deposits. The treasure map only shows the caches he hid around our property, but the ledger suggests he had operations in the national forest land too." The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. If Jeremiah Stone had established mining claims in the mountains, those claims might still be legally valid. The treasure they were finding around their property might be just the beginning of their potential wealth. "We need to research mineral rights and mining claims," Margaret said. "And we need to do it quickly." That afternoon, Margaret called Dr. Wells and arranged to meet at the courthouse in the county seat. If her great-grandfather had filed official mining claims, there would be public records documenting his activities. As they prepared for the trip to town, Margaret felt the weight of decisions that would affect not just her and Samuel's future, but potentially the future of Pine Ridge Valley itself. Harrison's development company might be planning to exploit mineral resources that rightfully belong to the Stone family. The coded ledger and the growing treasure caches were revealing a truth that changed everything. Her great-grandfather hadn't just been a miller who collected precious metals as a hobby. He had been a sophisticated mining operator who had accumulated substantial wealth and had taken careful steps to ensure that wealth would remain in family. Hence, tomorrow's research at the courthouse might reveal the full extent of their inheritance and their power to resist Harrison's pressure. The county courthouse stood like a fortress of red brick and limestone in the center of Millfield, Colorado. Margaret had driven the winding mountain roads with Dr. Wells beside her and Samuel in the back seat, all three of them tense with anticipation about what they might discover in the public records. Dr. Wells had called ahead to arrange access to the historical mining records, explaining their research as academic interest in local geological history. The clerk who met them, a helpful woman named Janet Morrison, seemed genuinely excited to assist with what she called one of the most interesting research requests we've had in years. Mining claims from the 1930s and 1940s are fascinating, Janet explained as she led them to the records room. Most people don't realize how much mining activity occurred in this region during that period. The Depression and then the war created unusual economic conditions that made small-scale mining operations quite profitable. Margaret's heart pounded as Janet pulled out several thick ledger books and boxes of documents. These records cover all mineral rights and mining claims filed in Pine Ridge Valley and the surrounding national forest land from 1920 through 1950. Dr. Wells took charge of the research, her academic experience making her efficient at navigating the complex filing systems. Samuel proved surprisingly helpful, his pattern recognition skills allowing him to quickly identify relevant entries as they worked through chronological records. "Here," Dr. Wells said after 20 minutes of searching. Jeremiah Stone, filed September 15th, 1933. Margaret leaned over Dr. Wells's shoulder as the elderly woman read from the official document. Mining claim number 1847, filed for precious metal extraction on public land, adjacent to private property in Pine Ridge Valley. Claimant, Jeremiah Stone. Location sections 14 and 15, Township 8 North, Range 75 West. What does that mean exactly? Margaret asked. Dr. Wells consulted a township map. It means your great-grandfather filed official claims on 2 sections of national forest land that border your family property. These aren't small claims, Margaret. We're talking about significant acreage in the mountains above your mill. Janet Morrison looked over their shoulders at the documents. "Oh my," she said with obvious excitement. "This is quite unusual. Most of the mining claims from that period were small placer operations, individual prospectors working creek beds. But this filing covers substantial territory and specifies hard rock mining rights." Samuel had been quietly reading through additional documents while the adults discussed the first discovery. "Mom," he said urgently, "there are more filings." "A lot more." Dr. Wells moved to examine Samuel's findings. Over the next hour, they discovered that Jeremiah Stone had filed a total of 7 mining claims between 1933 and 1942, covering nearly 3,000 acres of mountain land surrounding Pine Ridge Valley. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Wells murmured, spreading the claim maps across the research table. "Your great-grandfather essentially locked up mineral rights to most of the high country in this region." Margaret stared at the maps, trying to comprehend the scope of what they were seeing. "Are these claims still valid?" Janet Morrison consulted a reference manual. "Mining claims filed during this period remain valid, as long as annual maintenance fees were paid and minimum work requirements were met." "Let me check the payment records." The payment records told an even more remarkable story. Jeremiah Stone had faithfully maintained all 7 mining claims through 1943, the year of his death. After that, the payments had continued, made by Margaret's father until his death. And then, to Margaret's amazement, by a law firm in Denver acting as trustees for the Stone family estate. "I don't understand," Margaret said. "Dad never mentioned anything about mining claims or trustee payments." Dr. Wells studied the legal documents more carefully. "It appears your great-grandfather established a trust to ensure the claims would be maintained even if family members weren't aware of their existence. Look here. The trust document specifies that mineral rights should be preserved for future generations of the Stone family." Janet Morrison had been researching current status information on her computer. "According to our most recent records, all 7 claims remain active and legally valid. The trust has continued making payments through 2025. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair, overwhelmed by the implications. "You're telling me that my family owns mineral rights to 3,000 acres of mountain land?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you," Dr. Wells confirmed. "And based on the geological surveys I've seen of this region, those claims likely cover some of the richest mineral deposits in Colorado." Samuel had been studying one of the trust documents. "Mom, listen to this. The aforementioned mineral rights shall be transferred to direct descendants of Jeremiah Stone upon presentation of proper identification and completion of legal requirements set forth in this agreement." Dr. Wells took the document from Samuel and read it carefully. "Margaret, this is remarkable. Your great-grandfather didn't just leave you treasure around your property. He left you legal ownership of valuable mining operations. You're not just a mill owner struggling to pay bills. You're potentially one of the largest mineral rights holders in this part of Colorado." The weight of this revelation settled over Margaret like a physical force. Everything about her situation had suddenly changed. Harrison's pressure to sell the mill property, the development company's interest, even her own financial struggles. All of it looked completely different now. How much could these mining rights be worth? Margaret asked. Janet Morrison had been consulting additional reference materials. "Well, I shouldn't speculate about values, but I can tell you that similar mineral rights in Colorado have sold for millions of dollars in recent years." With current precious metal prices and modern extraction technology, she paused, clearly excited by the research they were conducting. Let's just say these claims could be extremely valuable. Dr. Wells was studying a geological survey map alongside the mining claim documents. Margaret, look at this. The claims your great-grandfather filed cover areas that recent geological surveys identify as high-probability zones for silver, gold, and rare earth mineral deposits. Rare earth minerals, Samuel asked. Elements used in modern electronics and renewable energy technology, Dr. Wells explained. They're incredibly valuable, and the demand has increased dramatically in recent years. Margaret felt as if the world had shifted beneath her feet. She had spent years worrying about paying property taxes on 20 acres of mill property, never knowing that her family owned mineral rights worth potentially millions of dollars. There's something else, Janet Morrison said, consulting her computer screen. These records show that there has been recent inquiry activity about these specific mining claims. Someone has been researching their status and ownership. What kind of inquiry? Dr. Wells asked. Legal research requests, geological survey consultations, and Janet paused, checking her screen more carefully. Market valuation assessments. Someone has been conducting due diligence on these claims within the past 6 months. Margaret's blood ran cold. 6 months? That's about when Harrison started pressuring me to sell the mill property. Dr. Wells and Samuel exchanged meaningful glances. The timeline was too convenient to be coincidental. Janet, Dr. Wells said carefully, would it be possible to determine who made these inquiries? Janet consulted her records. The requests came through a law firm in Denver, Blackwood, Sterling and Associates. They were acting on behalf of a client they didn't identify. Margaret's hands began to tremble. Harrison mentioned a development company from Denver. What if they're the same people? Dr. Wells gathered up the mining claim documents. Margaret, I think we need to consider the possibility that Harrison and his development company have known about these mineral rights all along. Their offer to purchase your mill property might be an attempt to gain control of access to mining claims worth far more than they're offering to pay. Samuel had been quietly processing everything they had learned. Mom, he said seriously, if we own mining rights worth millions of dollars, and if Harrison knows about them, then he's basically trying to steal our inheritance. Margaret nodded, feeling a surge of anger mixed with determination. Harrison's persistent pressure, his timeline demands, his increased offers. It all made sense now. He wasn't trying to help her solve financial problems. He was trying to acquire mineral rights at a fraction of their true value. What do we do now? Margaret asked. Dr. Wells smiled grimly. Now we make sure you properly claim your inheritance and protect it from people who would take advantage of your family. But first, we need to research the current market value of these claims and understand your legal rights. As they prepared to leave the courthouse, Margaret felt as if she was seeing her life clearly for the first time in years. Her great-grandfather hadn't just been a thoughtful man who saved money. He had been a visionary who had secured his family's future for generations. The treasure hunt that had begun with Samuel's discovery of a hidden letter had revealed something far greater than gold and silver coins. It had revealed that the Stone family owned assets that could transform not just their own lives, but the entire economic landscape of Pine Ridge Valley. Harrison's deadline suddenly seemed less threatening and more like an opportunity. When he called for her final answer, Margaret would be ready with information that would shift the balance of power completely. The drive back to Pine Ridge Valley passed in contemplative silence. Margaret's mind reeled with the implications of what they had discovered at the courthouse. Samuel sat in the passenger seat, carefully organizing the photocopied documents they had obtained. While Dr. Wells reviewed her notes from their research session, Margaret, Dr. Wells said, as they rounded the final curve before town, we need to move carefully from here. If Harrison and his associates have been researching your mineral rights for months, they're probably prepared for the possibility that you might discover the truth. Margaret nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. What do you think they'll do when they realize we know? That depends on how much money is at stake, Dr. Wells replied grimly, and how far they're willing to go to protect their investment. As they pulled into Margaret's driveway, Samuel pointed toward the mill. "Mum, there's someone down by the water wheel." Margaret's heart skipped as she recognized the figure standing near their family's mill. Thomas Harrison stood with his back to them, apparently examining the building's exterior. But he wasn't alone. Two men in expensive suits stood nearby, one of them taking photographs while the other consulted what appeared to be surveying equipment. "Stay in the car," Margaret told Samuel, though she could see the determination in her son's eyes that suggested he had no intention of remaining behind. Dr. Wells placed a reassuring hand on Margaret's shoulder. "Remember, you now have information they don't know you possess. That gives you the advantage." Margaret walked down the path toward the mill, her heart pounding, but her steps steady. Harrison turned as he heard her approaching, his practiced smile appearing instantly, though she noticed it didn't reach his eyes. "Ms. Stone," Harrison called with forced cheerfulness. "I hope you don't mind me bringing some colleagues by to look at the property. These gentlemen represent the development company I mentioned." The two men with Harrison were clearly not local. Everything about them, from their polished shoes to their calculated expressions, spoke of serious money and corporate power. The older of the two stepped forward, extending his hand. "Ms. Stone, I'm Robert Blackwood from Blackwood, Sterling and Associates," he said smoothly. "We're very interested in your property and hope to discuss some exciting opportunities with you." Margaret felt a chill of recognition. This was the same law firm that had been researching her family's mining claims. She forced herself to maintain a neutral expression while her mind raced with the implications of his presence. "What kind of opportunities?" Margaret asked carefully. Blackwood smiled with practiced charm. "Well, beyond the generous offer Mr. Harrison has already presented, we've identified additional potential for this property that could benefit everyone involved." Additional potential? The second man, who had introduced himself as James Sterling, consulted a tablet computer. "Our geological consultants believe this area may have significant mineral development possibilities. We'd be prepared to offer substantially more than the original $300,000 if you're willing to include mineral rights in any potential sale." Margaret's pulse quickened, but she kept her voice steady. "Mineral rights? I wasn't aware there were any mineral rights associated with this property." Blackwood and Sterling exchanged a quick glance that confirmed Margaret's suspicions. They knew exactly what mineral rights existed, and they were testing to see how much she knew. "Oh, there are always mineral considerations with mountain property," Blackwood said casually. "Most family landowners aren't aware of the technical details, but our research suggests there could be valuable deposits in this region." "How valuable?" Margaret asked. Sterling consulted his tablet again. "Well, it's difficult to say without extensive surveys, but we'd be prepared to increase our offer to $500,000 for the complete property package, including any mineral rights that might exist." Margaret almost laughed at the audacity of their offer. They were proposing to pay $500,000 for mineral rights that could be worth tens of millions. But she maintained her composed exterior, remembering Dr. Wells's advice about information being power. "That's certainly worth considering," Margaret said neutrally. "But I'd need some time to research what mineral rights might actually exist." Blackwood's smile became slightly strained. "Of course. Though I should mention that our offer is time-sensitive. Market conditions change rapidly in the development business." Harrison stepped forward, adding his pressure to the conversation. "Miss Stone, with respect, you've been struggling financially for years. This offer represents security for you and your son that you might not see again." Samuel had apparently decided to ignore his mother's instruction to stay in the car, because he appeared at Margaret's side, carrying his notebook and several of the documents they had photocopied at the courthouse. "Mom," Samuel said innocently, "should I show them the mining claim documents we found today?" The effect of Samuel's words on the three men was immediate and telling. Blackwood's practiced composure slipped noticeably, while Sterling actually took a step backward. Harrison's face went pale. "Mining claim documents? Blackwood asked, his voice carefully controlled. Margaret realized that Samuel, with the instincts of youth, had perfectly executed a strategic revelation. Now she knew for certain that these men were fully aware of her family's mineral rights. "Yes," Margaret said, taking the documents from Samuel. "We've been researching our family history and discovered some interesting records at the courthouse today. It seems my great-grandfather was more involved in mining than we realized." Dr. Wells appeared beside them, her academic credentials lending weight to their position. "It's quite remarkable, actually. The Stone family appears to own substantial mineral rights throughout this region. We're still researching the full extent and current value, of course." Blackwood's expression had shifted from confident charm to calculating concern. "What exactly did you discover?" Margaret smiled pleasantly. "Well, as you mentioned, market conditions change rapidly. I think I'll need to do more research before making any decisions about selling." Sterling was typing rapidly on his tablet, probably communicating with associates about this unexpected development. Harrison looked like a man whose carefully laid plans were crumbling before his eyes. "Miss Stone," Blackwood said, his tone becoming more serious, "I hope you understand that mineral rights can be complex legal matters. It's important to work with experienced professionals who understand the regulatory requirements and market realities." "Oh, I completely agree," Margaret replied. "That's why we'll be consulting with mineral rights attorneys and geological experts before making any decisions." The three men exchanged glances that spoke of urgent private conversations they needed to have. Blackwood handed Margaret an elegant business card. "Please keep us informed of your research," he said. "We remain very interested in working with you, and we're prepared to be quite flexible in our arrangements." After the men left, Margaret, Samuel, and Dr. Wells gathered in the kitchen to process what had just occurred. "They know," Dr. Wells said simply. "They know exactly what mineral rights exist, and they've been planning to acquire them for far less than their true value." Samuel was studying the business card Blackwood had left. "Mom, this is the same law firm that was researching our mining claims at the courthouse." Margaret nodded grimly. "They've probably been planning this acquisition for months, maybe years. They researched our financial situation, identified our vulnerabilities, and approached us when they thought we'd be most likely to sell quickly." "What do we do now?" Samuel asked. Dr. Wells was already reaching for her phone. "Now we level the playing field. I'm calling a colleague of mine who specializes in mineral rights law. It's time you had professional representation that's working for your interests instead of against them." Margaret felt a surge of determination. For years, she had felt helpless in the face of financial pressure and community judgment. But now she understood that she wasn't a desperate woman clinging to worthless property. She was the owner of valuable assets that others were trying to steal. "There's something else we need to do," Margaret realized. "We need to complete great-grandfather's treasure map. If Blackwood and his associates are willing to offer $500,000 for mineral rights worth millions, there's no telling what they might be willing to do to prevent us from claiming our full inheritance." Samuel's eyes lit up with understanding. "The final cache. According to the map, there should be one more location." Dr. Wells looked up from her phone call arrangements. "What's at the final location?" Margaret consulted the original treasure map they had found in the creek. "According to great-grandfather's notations, it's the location of the master documents, the papers that officially transfer all mineral rights to his descendants." "Then that's our priority," Dr. Wells said firmly. "We need to find those documents before Blackwood's people realize we don't have complete legal control yet." Margaret looked out the window toward the mill. Its familiar silhouette now representing not just family heritage, but substantial wealth and power. Her great-grandfather had planned for this moment, anticipating that future generations might face pressure to surrender their inheritance. Tomorrow, they would find the final cache and claim what Jeremiah Stone had left for them. But tonight, Margaret would sleep knowing that she was no longer fighting to hold on to a crumbling past. She was fighting to claim a prosperous future that her family rightfully owned. Dawn broke grey and misty over Pine Ridge Valley. But Margaret had been awake for hours. She stood at her kitchen window, watching the mill emerge from the morning fog, while her coffee grew cold in her hands. Today would determine whether her family claimed their rightful inheritance or lost everything to corporate manipulation. Samuel appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed and carrying his notebook. Despite the gravity of their situation, or perhaps because of it, the boy seemed energized by the challenge ahead. "I've been studying the final location on great-grandfather's map," Samuel said, spreading the documents across the kitchen table. "It's different from all the others." Margaret joined him at the table, noting the symbols Samuel had circled on the treasure map. While the previous cache locations had been marked with simple indicators, the final location bore multiple symbols and what appeared to be detailed instructions. "What do you think it means?" Margaret asked. Samuel traced the symbols with his finger. "I think this location requires solving a puzzle before we can find the cache. Look, these symbols reference specific parts of the mill's construction, and these numbers might be measurements or coordinates." Margaret studied the notations more carefully. Her great-grandfather had indeed created a more complex challenge for the final cache. The symbols referenced the mill's grinding stones, the water wheel, and what appeared to be astronomical markers, positions of the sun or moon that would align with specific architectural features. He was protecting the most important documents, Margaret realized. The master papers that officially transfer mineral rights would be the most valuable thing he left behind. A knock at the kitchen door interrupted their analysis. Emma stood on the porch, but she wasn't alone. A distinguished woman in her 60s accompanied her, carrying a briefcase and wearing the confident bearing of someone accustomed to handling complex legal matters. "Margaret," Emma said as they entered, "this is attorney Sarah Morrison, Janet's sister from the courthouse. She specializes in mineral rights law." Sarah Morrison had driven through the night from Denver after Dr. Wells contacted her about the Stone family's situation. Her reputation for protecting landowners from corporate exploitation had made her one of Colorado's most respected mineral rights attorneys. "Ms. Stone," Attorney Morrison said, settling at the kitchen table, "Dr. Wells has briefed me on your situation. I've reviewed the preliminary documents, and I must say, your great-grandfather was extraordinarily thorough in protecting your family's interests." Margaret felt a surge of hope. "Can we legally claim the mineral rights?" "Based on what I've seen so far, absolutely," Morrison replied. "The mining claims are properly filed and have been maintained according to federal requirements. The trust structure is legally sound." But she paused, consulting her notes. "We need the master transfer documents to complete the legal process. Without them, Blackwood's firm could challenge your claim in court and delay resolution for years." Samuel leaned forward eagerly. "We know where the master documents are hidden. We just need to solve great-grandfather's final puzzle." Morrison examined the treasure map with professional interest. Jeremiah Stone clearly understood the importance of protecting these documents. "If Blackwood's people have been researching your claims for months, they may have also tried to locate these transfer papers." Margaret felt a chill of worry. "You think they might have already found them?" "It's possible," Morrison admitted. "But if your great-grandfather was as careful as these other caches suggest, he probably designed the final location to be accessible only to family members who possessed specific knowledge about the mill." Emma had been studying the puzzle symbols while the attorney spoke. "Margaret, some of these markings look familiar. Didn't your father teach you about reading the mill's seasonal alignments?" Margaret's eyes widened with sudden understanding. Her father had indeed taught her how the mill's windows and doorways had been positioned to track seasonal changes, knowledge that practical millers needed to optimize grain drying and storage. "The astronomical markers," Margaret said excitedly. Great-grandfather included seasonal alignments in his puzzle because he knew that knowledge would be passed down through the family. Samuel was already calculating angles and measurements from the puzzle symbols. "If we're right about the seasonal alignments, we need to be at the mill at a specific time of day when the sun creates the right shadows and light patterns." Morrison checked her watch. "What time frame are we looking at?" Margaret consulted her father's old notes about the mill's seasonal features. Based on the date references in the puzzle, I think we need to be there around 10 o'clock this morning, when the autumn sun reaches the angle great-grandfather specified. As they prepared to leave for the mill, Morrison offered a warning. Be aware that Blackwood's people may be watching your activities. If they suspect you're close to finding the master documents, they might try to interfere. Margaret looked at her son's determined face and her loyal friends who had rallied to support her family. Then we'd better make sure we find those documents first. The group walked toward the mill together, the morning mist beginning to clear as the sun climbed higher. Margaret carried her great-grandfather's puzzle map while Samuel brought his notebook full of calculations, and Emma and Morrison provided moral support and legal expertise. The final cache awaited them somewhere within the mill's carefully designed architecture, protected by a puzzle that only family members could solve. Margaret felt the weight of generations, of Stone family determination as they approached the building that had sheltered their most precious secrets. For more than 80 years, the mill's interior felt different, with the morning sun streaming through the carefully positioned windows. Margaret stood in the center of the grinding floor, watching shafts of light create patterns that her father had taught her to read decades ago. Samuel moved around the space with his notebook, measuring angles and comparing them to the symbols on great-grandfather's puzzle map. The light is hitting the eastern grinding stone exactly where the map indicates, Samuel reported. And if I'm reading these measurements correctly, we need to wait about 15 more minutes for the sun to reach the precise position. Attorney Morrison stood near the doorway, keeping watch for any sign of unwanted visitors. Emma examined the mill's construction details, noting how Jeremiah Stone had incorporated astronomical features into what appeared to be simple, functional architecture. Your great-grandfather was remarkably sophisticated, Morrison observed, creating a time-locked puzzle that could only be solved by family members with specific knowledge. Shows extraordinary foresight. Margaret walked to the western wall, where her father had taught her to observe the seasonal light patterns. As the sun continued its arc across the sky, shadows from the mill's interior beams began aligning with carved marks in the stone floor, marks she had never noticed before, but which now seemed obviously deliberate. "Samuel," Margaret called softly. "Bring the map over here." Samuel joined his mother, and together they watched as the advancing sunlight revealed the final elements of great-grandfather's puzzle. The carved marks in the floor formed an arrow pointing toward a section of the western wall that looked identical to the surrounding stonework. "According to the puzzle," Samuel said, consulting his calculations, "when the sun reaches the exact position marked on the map, it should illuminate something specific on that wall." They waited in tense silence as the sunlight crept across the mill floor. Emma and Morrison watched from their positions, everyone aware that they were minutes away from either triumph or disappointment. "There!" Samuel suddenly exclaimed. A narrow beam of sunlight, perfectly aligned by the mill's window placement and interior architecture, struck a small section of the western wall. The light revealed what appeared to be a symbol carved so subtly into the stone that it was invisible except under specific lighting conditions. Margaret approached the illuminated symbol, recognizing the same mill wheel design they had found at previous cache locations. But this carving was more elaborate, surrounded by additional markings that became visible only in the direct sunlight. "It's beautiful," Emma whispered, watching the hidden artwork emerge in the precisely angled light. Samuel consulted the puzzle map one final time. "According to great-grandfather's instructions, the symbol should show us how to access the final cache." Margaret examined the carved design more closely, noting how certain elements seemed to indicate pressure points or manipulation sequences. Following the visual instructions, she pressed specific parts of the symbol in the order suggested by the carving. A section of the stone wall, perhaps 3 feet square, began to shift inward. Unlike the simple hiding places they had discovered at other locations, this was clearly the entrance to a more substantial chamber. "Incredible engineering," Morrison murmured as they watched the stone panel swing open on hidden hinges. Your great-grandfather created something that would function perfectly after 80 years. The chamber beyond was larger than Margaret had expected, carved directly into the mill's stone foundation. Inside, protected by the dry mountain air and careful construction, waited several wooden boxes and what appeared to be a substantial document collection wrapped in oiled leather. Margaret carefully lifted the document bundle, her hands trembling with anticipation. The leather wrapping bore her great-grandfather's seal and a note in his distinctive handwriting. For my descendants who have proven worthy of this trust. Inside the bundle were the master documents Attorney Morrison needed, official mineral rights transfer papers, updated trust agreements, and geological surveys that documented the full extent of the family's mining claims. These are perfect, Morrison said, examining the legal papers with obvious relief. And with these documents, your ownership of the mineral rights is absolutely unquestionable. But it was Samuel who discovered the most significant item in the final cache. Wrapped separately in silk cloth was a contemporary geological survey, not from the 1940s, but dated just 3 years earlier. Mom, Samuel said urgently. Look at this. Margaret took the modern survey report, noting its official Colorado Geological Survey letterhead. The document assessed mineral deposits throughout the Pine Ridge Valley region, with specific focus on the areas covered by Jeremiah Stone's mining claims. The estimated value, Margaret read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, ranges from $12 to $18 million, based on current market prices for precious metals and rare earth elements. The chamber fell silent as the magnitude of their discovery settled over them. Margaret wasn't just the owner of family property. Struggling with financial difficulties, she was the holder of mining rights worth more than most people earned in multiple lifetimes. How did great-grandfather get a survey from 3 years ago? Emma asked, confused by the timeline. Morrison examined the survey more carefully. This isn't from your great-grandfather, she realized. Someone else placed this document in the cache recently. Someone who wanted you to understand the true value of what you own. Margaret felt a chill of understanding. Dr. Wells. She must have conducted her own research and left this for us to find. Outside the mill, the sound of car engines drew their attention. Through the windows, they could see several vehicles approaching, including Harrison's familiar sedan and 2 SUVs they didn't recognize. Time to go, Morrison said firmly, gathering the precious documents. We have what we came for, and it's time to make sure these papers are properly secured. Margaret took one last look around the chamber that had protected her family's future for so many decades. Her great-grandfather's final gift was not just wealth, it was the knowledge and legal standing to protect that wealth from those who would steal it. 6 months later, the sound of the restored mill wheel turning in Clear Creek filled Pine Ridge Valley with a music that hadn't been heard for 20 years. Margaret stood on the mill's front porch, watching the massive wooden wheel turn steadily in the mountain stream, its restoration complete and its purpose renewed. The transformation had been remarkable. What had once been a crumbling reminder of past glory was now a beautifully maintained historical landmark that drew visitors from across Colorado. The mill operated both as a working grain facility for local farmers and as an educational center where visitors could learn about traditional milling techniques and the region's mining history. Samuel emerged from the mill's interior, his clothes dusted with flour and his face bright with satisfaction. At 13, he had become the mill's unofficial expert on its mechanical operations, able to explain the intricate gear systems and stone adjustments to fascinated tourists. The new grinding stones are working perfectly, Samuel reported. Mr. Peterson's wheat batch came out exactly right. He says it's the best flour he's ever produced. Margaret smiled, remembering how different their lives had been just half a year earlier. The legal battle with Blackwood's development company had been swift and decisive once Attorney Morrison filed the proper mineral rights documents. Harrison's firm had quickly abandoned their aggressive acquisition attempts when faced with clear evidence. of the Stone family's legal ownership. Any word from Dr. Wells about the Historical Society meeting? Samuel asked. Margaret checked her phone for messages. Dr. Wells had been instrumental in establishing the Pine Ridge Valley Historical Society, with the restored mill serving as its headquarters. The society had received grants to document the region's mining history and create educational programs that honored both the Stone family legacy and the broader community heritage. She says the meeting went very well, Margaret reported. The Historical Society received approval for the new mining heritage trail that will connect our mill to the museum sites up in the mountains. The mining heritage trail had been Margaret's idea, a way to share the remarkable story of her great-grandfather's operations while preserving the natural beauty of the high country. Visitors could follow designated paths to see historical mining sites, learn about geological formations, and understand how early settlers had worked with the mountain's natural resources. Emma appeared on the path from town, carrying a basket and wearing the contented expression of someone bringing good news. Emma had been appointed as the mill's business manager, helping coordinate educational programs and tourist activities. Her practical nature and deep community connections made her perfect for the role. The September bookings are completely full, Emma announced. We have 3 school groups scheduled, 2 historical society tours, and a group of geology students from the university. Margaret marveled at how the mill had become a source of community pride rather than embarrassment. Families who had once whispered about Margaret's stubbornness now brought their children to learn about local history. The mill's success had created jobs for several valley residents and brought new economic activity to the region. There's something else, Emma continued with a mysterious smile. Harrison stopped by this morning. Margaret raised an eyebrow. Thomas Harrison had maintained a low profile since the legal resolution of the mineral rights dispute. Blackwood's law firm had been investigated for unethical business practices, and Harrison had quietly left his position at the bank. What did he want? To apologize, Emma said, and to ask if you might have any part-time work available. Apparently, his reputation in the banking industry has suffered since the mineral rights investigation. Margaret considered this information with mixed feelings. Harrison's actions had been unethical, but she understood the desperation that could drive people to make poor choices. What did you tell him? That I'd mention it to you, Emma replied. The mill could use someone with his financial experience, especially now that we're managing both historical operations and mining revenues. Samuel looked up from adjusting the water wheel mechanism. Do you think we should trust him? Margaret pondered the question. The mining operations had proven even more valuable than the geological surveys had predicted. Working with responsible extraction companies, the Stone family was earning substantial royalties while ensuring environmental protection. Trust was indeed precious. Everyone deserves a second chance, Margaret said finally. But trust has to be earned. Dr. Wells appeared on the path from her house, moving with her characteristic energy despite her 70-plus years. She had become the mill's unofficial historian, documenting the remarkable story of Jeremiah Stone's foresight and his family's eventual vindication. Margaret, Dr. Wells called, I have wonderful news. The Colorado Historical Society wants to feature your family's story in their annual publication. They're calling it The Miller's Secret, How One Family's Heritage Preserved Mountain History. Margaret felt a warm glow of satisfaction. Her great-grandfather's story would inspire other families to value their heritage and resist pressure to abandon family. Legacies for short-term financial gain. As the afternoon sun began to set behind the mountains, Margaret found herself standing beside the restored water wheel, exactly where her great-grandfather's letter had promised she would find answers. Samuel joined her, and together they watched the wheel turn steadily in the clear mountain stream. Do you think great-grandfather knew this would happen? Samuel asked. Margaret considered the question seriously. I think he knew that if his descendants were worthy of the trust he placed in them, they would find a way to honor both the past and the future. Samuel nodded thoughtfully. What do you think he'd say about the mill now? Margaret smiled, listening to the steady rhythm of the turning wheel and the gentle sound of Clear Creek flowing beneath it. I think he'd say that some things are worth preserving because they connect us to who we are and remind us of what's truly valuable. Above them, the first stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The mill stood strong against the mountain backdrop, its carefully crafted stones and timbers ready to serve another generation. Margaret had learned that true wealth wasn't just about money or property. It was about understanding your place in a story that began before you and would continue long after you were gone. Samuel pulled a folded paper from his pocket, another letter he had discovered that morning, in the mill's archive. "Mom," he said with a grin, "I think great-grandfather left us one more mystery to solve." Margaret laughed, feeling the familiar thrill of discovery, mixed with the deep satisfaction of knowing her family's story was far from over. The mill wheel turned steadily in the stream, carrying both memory and possibility forward into whatever adventures lay ahead.